What most people don't see is that an empath doesn't react to being replaced immediately. They register it, not as a single moment, but as a pattern forming beneath the surface. It looks like silence, but internally it's accumulation. They notice the shift in tone before the shift in behavior, the delayed replies, the altered energy, the subtle withdrawal that isn't explained, only performed. And instead of confronting it, they begin observing it quietly, precisely, almost clinically. Because an empath doesn't panic at first. They analyze. They replay conversations not to suffer, but to locate the exact moment the pattern began to change. And this is where it begins to shift, not externally, but internally. Because while others assume the empath is unaware, what's actually happening is far more complex. They are aware, but they are also filtering intention from behavior, filtering temporary inconsistency from emerging pattern, and most importantly, filtering truth from. What they hope is still repairable, but internally, something else is happening, something slower, something far more irreversible than reaction. It looks like they're giving space, but internally, they're running simulations. They test possibilities. Maybe they're just busy, maybe I'm overthinking, maybe this is temporary. And each of these thoughts isn't random, it's protective reasoning designed to delay conclusion. Because recognizing replacement isn't just about seeing someone else step in, it's about accepting that your emotional presence is no longer being prioritized. And that realization doesn't arrive suddenly. It leaks in through inconsistencies, through emotional gaps, through moments that feel slightly off, but not enough to justify confrontation. So the empath stays, not because they don't see it, but because they see too much. They understand context, nuance, emotional fluctuation. And that understanding becomes the very thing that keeps them in place longer than they should be, because when you can explain behavior, you can also excuse it. And this is where the internal conflict deepens. It looks like patience, but internally it's tension building without release. The empath starts noticing repetition. Not one delayed response, but a pattern of distance. Not one change in tone, but a consistent emotional flatness. And patterns are different. Patterns don't ask for interpretation, they demand recognition. But here's the psychological split. Recognition doesn't immediately lead to action, because the empath doesn't just process what is happening, they process what it means. And meaning carries weight. It carries emotional consequence. So instead of reacting outwardly, they begin adjusting inwardly. They become quieter, not to manipulate the situation, but to observe it without interference. Because any forced reaction would contaminate the data they're collecting. And what they want more than reassurance is clarity. Pure, undeniable clarity. Even if it hurts, what most people misunderstand is this: an empath doesn't feel replaced the moment attention shifts. They feel replaced the moment effort stops being reciprocal. And that distinction is everything. Because attention can fluctuate, but effort reveals intention. And when effort becomes inconsistent, the empath doesn't chase it. They study it. They notice who initiates, who withdraws, who compensates, and who slowly disengages without explanation. And this is where emotional fatigue begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like carrying weight that no one else acknowledges. Because the empath is still showing up, still listening, still understanding. But now, they're also noticing the imbalance. And once imbalance is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. But internally, something even more significant begins to form: distance. Not physical distance, psychological distance. It looks like they're still present, but internally, they're stepping back. Just slightly, just enough to observe without absorbing everything. And this shift is almost invisible to others, because the empath doesn't announce it. They don't declare detachment. They simply begin to reduce emotional investment in places where it's no longer being matched, but they do it slowly, because sudden withdrawal would feel like a reaction, and this isn't reaction. This is recalibration. They start noticing how often they initiate connection. How often are they the ones maintaining emotional continuity? How often they're filling silence that shouldn't exist? And once they see it, they test it. They pull back just a little, not to punish, but to measure, to see what happens when they stop compensating for the imbalance. And what happens next is what confirms everything, because absence reveals what presence was hiding. And when the empath stops overextending, the silence becomes louder, not externally, but internally. Because now there's nothing masking the truth, no extra effort, emotional buffering, just raw behavioral evidence. And this is where the realization begins to solidify not as a thought, but as a pattern that no longer changes, no matter how much understanding is applied to it. And still, they don't react. They observe one more time, just to be certain. Because once they accept it, there's no returning to how they used to feel, only forward into something much quieter and much more controlled. And this is where the pattern stops being subtle and starts becoming undeniable. Not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing changes. The empath begins to notice that their emotional consistency is no longer being mirrored. They show up the same way, but the response they receive is increasingly fragmented, delayed, diluted. And what most people would interpret as distance, the empath interprets as data. Because behavior, when repeated without correction, is no longer accidental. It's established. And this is where the internal tension sharpens, because now it's no longer about confusion, it's about confirmation. What most people don't see is that an empath doesn't just feel the absence of effort, they measure it against their own. They compare emotional input versus output, presence versus response, attention versus reciprocity. And when those ratios stop aligning, something begins to fracture internally. Not loudly, not visibly, but precisely. It looks like they're still giving, but internally they've started tracking. They notice how often they initiate conversations, how often they adjust their tone to maintain connection, how often do they soften their own needs to avoid creating pressure. And more importantly, they notice how little is returned without prompting. And this is where reinforcement begins to reveal itself, because the other person has learned something without being consciously aware of it. They've learned that the empath will compensate, that no matter how inconsistent they become, the connection will still be maintained not by mutual effort, but by one-sided emotional regulation. And once that pattern is reinforced, it stabilizes, not into balance, but into dependency. The empath becomes the stabilizer, the emotional anchor, the one who absorbs fluctuation so the other person doesn't have to feel it. And this is where the cost begins to accumulate. It looks like understanding, but internally it's overextension. The empath starts justifying behavior that no longer deserves context. They're going through something, they don't mean it. They'll come back to how they were. And each justification isn't weakness, it's pattern protection. Because accepting the truth would require disrupting the emotional investment they've already made. And the mind resists that disruption. So instead it creates continuity. It builds a narrative where inconsistency still fits inside a framework of meaning. But patterns don't adjust to narratives. Narratives adjust to patterns. And this is where the empath begins to feel something they can't immediately explain. Emotional exhaustion without visible conflict. Because nothing has officially gone wrong. There's no clear argument, no defining moment, just a slow erosion of reciprocity. And this is what makes it difficult to confront. Because confrontation requires clarity. And clarity requires a single event. But this isn't a single event. This is accumulation. Micro shifts, repeated behaviors, subtle withdrawals, and the empath is tracking all of it. Not consciously, not in a list, but internally through emotional pattern recognition. And over time, that recognition becomes undeniable. Because when something repeats without correction, it's no longer a phase, it's a decision. And this is where the internal dialogue changes. Not in tone, but in direction. It shifts from what's happening to why am I still allowing this? It looks like they're still patient, but internally, they've started questioning themselves. Not their worth, but their positioning. They begin to analyze their own behavior within the pattern. Why did they keep compensating? Why did they keep initiating? Why did they keep interpreting instead of responding? And this isn't self-blame. It's self-observation. Because the empath isn't just decoding others, they're decoding themselves. They realize that their ability to understand became the very mechanism that allowed the imbalance to continue. That their emotional intelligence, when unfiltered, turned into emotional availability without boundary. And that availability became predictable, expected, unchallenged. And once something becomes unchallenged, it becomes normalized. What most people miss is this: the moment an empath feels replaced isn't when someone else appears, it's when their effort stops being necessary. Because replacement isn't always about another person. Sometimes it's about the absence of resistance, the absence of consequence, the absence of anything that would interrupt the comfort of imbalance. And when the empath sees this clearly, the emotional weight shifts, not outward, but inward. They stop asking for explanation because the behavior has already explained everything. And this is where something begins to form, not reaction, not confrontation, but awareness that no longer seeks validation. It looks like they're still there, but internally, they've started withdrawing energy, not dramatically. Not abruptly, but deliberately. They reduce how much they explain, how much they initiate, how much they emotionally invest without receiving equivalent engagement. And this isn't punishment, it's calibration. Because now they're no longer trying to sustain the connection, they're testing its actual structure. They want to see what remains when they stop holding it together. And what remains is what was always there, just previously hidden by their effort. And this realization doesn't create immediate action. It creates quiet clarity, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. Because once the empath sees the pattern fully, they no longer need to interpret it. They no longer need to give it context. They no longer need to hope it will shift. They simply observe it without interfering, without adjusting, without compensating. And in that stillness, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And this is where everything becomes quieter, but far more precise. Because once the pattern is fully seen, the empath stops searching for new interpretations. Not because they've stopped caring, but because they've stopped negotiating with what is already clear. What most people don't understand is that clarity for an empath doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as compression. A tightening of awareness where every previous moment reorganizes itself into a single coherent pattern. Conversations that once felt confusing now feel predictable. Silences that once felt ambiguous now feel intentional. And behaviors that once invited explanation now require none, because the empath is no longer asking, what does this mean? They're recognizing this has always meant the same thing, and this is where the internal shift becomes irreversible. It looks like acceptance,